like. Can you tell me like your background in like media, like where you went to school, what you're doing for this university?
Yeah, so I did my bachelor's at Lake Forest College, which is a liberal arts college near Chicago. I was a communication and politics major there, and then I also did a lot of college radio and a lot of research on radio and podcasting and stuff like that when I was there. And then I did my master's in communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and again wrote a lot about history and new media history and stuff like that. And then I'm in the Institute of Communications Research here. It's my fourth year. And my research focuses on internet policies, especially the internet policies being written during the 1990s and the ways in which that sort of policy was exported internationally.
And what classes do you teach here?
Just this one right now. Prior to this, I taught the intro level class, MACS 101, and then I was also did discussion questions for the new media class, MACS 326.
Okay. We'll just like start with like advertisements.
Sure.
Let's see, which one? How does advertising differ from those targeting adults than children? And why do you think the U.S. has less regulations than other countries?
As far as regulations, I think when we look at the lobbying that happens in the United States, there's a lot of lobbying happening from media companies. And why we don't regulate to children is there's a lot of money to be made off of media that are targeted at children and advertising that is targeted at children. And so, as in terms of what products are being advertised to children and adults, obviously there's a difference there. But I think all the advertising for both of those groups really targets, insecurities might be a strong word, but, sort of develops needs or turns wants into needs, I would say, for both children and adults. But yeah, I don't see children's advertising really going away given the sort of interest that would like to keep it around.
Do you think that's like a problem? Like children's advertising, like, do you think it's like manipulative or in any way?
I think the issue is adults can be manipulated by advertising as much as children and that sort of thing. But I think that there is a kind of literacy that goes with reading media that children just haven't developed or haven't been taught to develop. So to expose them to it so early challenges, their ability later on, I think, to critically assess what ads are meant to do and who's benefiting from ads. And so to teach them that before they're exposed to that, I think would be a helpful way to deal with this part of the world that becomes so omnipresent later in their lives.
Okay. So let's like move on to like online. So like, what are some like costs and benefits of data mining and like the use of cookies and stuff like that? Are targeted ads like problematic at all?
I think that the sort of most salient argument that comes in favor of data mining and in favor of targeted advertising is that people say, at least when I'm seeing ads, which are going to be there no matter what, I'm seeing ads that speak to my interests and that are actually relevant to my life. And so I think, it's a perfectly fine argument to make. I do think going, again, a level beneath that or deeper than that and looking at exactly who's benefiting from that process is important. I also think how data is being used and making that a more sort of transparent process would also be helpful for people to actually make smart decisions about whether having advertising that's relevant to their lives is worth the cost of their personal information. To perhaps give them an opportunity to opt in or opt out, or to try and do things with their online identity to sort of put up barriers or to protect themselves from that kind of data mining effort.
Okay. So schools and education institutions are starting to use like technology and social media and online platforms in the classroom. And in 2012, Google Apps for Education admitted to using student emails and stuff like that, personal information for their other products that kind of like ties in with targeted ads and stuff like that. So how like safe and secure are educational platforms? I know like just beyond like Google, but like maybe like Blackboard, Moodle, and like Scalar, like do you think those could raise any issues in the future about how they handle information of students?
Yeah, I wasn't actually familiar with that case, but Google is going into all sorts of schools. I think they have a partnership with some Chicago public schools as well to bring technology into the classroom. And it's a hard balance because on the one hand, to be part of the world in this, contemporary era, you need to know how to use technology.
Mm-hmm.
You need to know how to use social media and, use web platforms successfully. That's part of the sort of education. But when schools don't have those funds and they turn to these private organizations to do that work, they're giving up their autonomy and their control of those systems as well, and opening up, I think, their students to some problems there, right? Because students, if they're required to do these projects, can't opt out of using a system where their data is mined. In fact, it's hard for anyone, whether or not you're a student, to opt out of systems where your data is mined. So giving people the opportunity to actually see what's happening there and to be transparent about it and have it not only come up when it's a controversy that gets revealed would be important. And so to know if Google's going to be involved in education, to know exactly where the line is drawn and have that be a very explicit line, I think would be a really important part. And I wouldn't be surprised if other educational tools online had those sorts of issues come up in the future as well, as they opened up to more sort of private interests.
So that's a good segue to crossing lines and the gray area. So in regards to surveillance, government surveillance, what is the gray area or the line of protecting citizens from harm and surveilling, or then violating privacy? So where is that line? Where's that balance, and what's appropriate for surveillance?
Yeah, it's a huge question and a super important question and a very hard one. I think that line between privacy and surveillance gets sort of drawn by historical context, and it's moving constantly, and that makes it hard for people to really understand what's going on. Obviously, it's also affected by what technology is available and how people can be monitored, right? We live in an era where there's cameras everywhere and where your data can be followed and your cell phone data can be tracked, not only proactively, but retroactively. And so, the issue, I think, is defining, again, in a clear way, and I realize I'm saying that a lot. I think there's a sort of transparency that people are owed, perhaps, to know exactly what the threshold is for being surveilled, or knowing exactly what sort of offenses are considered surveillable or not. When we watch Citizen4, you see that number at the end where you see how many people are on this watch list, and it's a huge number. And certainly we want to be able to surveil people who are actual threats, and we want some people to be on a watch list. But that number is so big that you have to sort of infer from that there are some criteria that you might not think of as being offenses that become offenses. And then all your history and all your future activity is open to be monitored. And so to know exactly what those criteria are is important. I think to know, what the threshold is for that is important. And then for people, if they do know they're being surveilled, to have access to exactly what information about them is being kept. And that came up in Citizen4 as well, right? Where in other countries you can actually ask for your file of what data is kept. To give people the option to do that, I think would also be good. Probably a lot of people wouldn't take it, because I do think there is a certain trust that's placed that people are only being surveilled when they're doing something wrong. But people need the option to know what's happening, or at least on a broader level, to know what the criteria are under which people are monitored. I think would be at least a little bit helpful as a start.
So you think that would be a way for the people of America and around the world to get trust back to the government, or what are some repercussions the government might face, to regain the trust of the citizens?
It's very hard. I think, these recent scandals have shown people, I think people know the government does a lot of stuff they don't know about. And I think most people are largely okay with that to a certain degree. But there's also issues where you have, the president or the head of the NSA saying explicitly, we don't spy on Americans. And then when you counteract that, it's very hard to regain that trust, or when you see that they're keeping, So on a sort of domestic level, I think trying to be as transparent as possible is good. I think there probably is always the assumption, at least among skeptics, that there's always going to be something the government is hiding from us. And again, maybe that's okay, maybe it's not, depending on who you ask. Internationally, I think it's a little more difficult. But I think that some possible inroads into that come in terms of sort of internet policies and internet governance, which is on my mind because I researched that, so it's my bias a little. But you know, for a long time, the internet and internet policy has very much been defined by the United States. And for a long time, all internet traffic was going through the United States. And that gives the United States the sort of central power over a system that's supposed to be open and global. And so there's been sort of more recent efforts to bring in other countries and to make the governance of the internet and the control of sort of internet infrastructure more multinational. So I think efforts like that, where you see the United States being more diplomatic and you know, sort of giving over some of their control of this system in a more balanced way to other international players, helps a little bit. It doesn't fix it entirely, but when these talks were happening about making internet governance more global, Brazil was a big player in that. And they were also a country that underwent a lot of surveillance. Their president was surveilled by the United States. It was that big controversy for obvious reasons, right? It's a head of state who's being monitored.
Or like Angela Merkel.
Yeah.
Controversy too.
Absolutely. And so you have the president of Brazil, who's obviously very upset about this, after these talks about expanding internet governance and bringing Brazil and these other countries who were previously left out into the fold. And she actually said, you know, like, I trust Obama a lot more now. And that's just the head of state, but you could see perhaps other international citizens, if they see their heads of state putting more faith in the US government and their sort of openness in the sort of internet policy, it might spread.
You talked a little bit about like transparency.
Yeah.
Surely the government should have like some secret
Yes.
to protect like national security.
Absolutely.
So what kind of information should be made public and what should be kept secret?
I mean, there's so much information that should be kept secret that I don't even know it would exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about things like military operations, that seems like a pretty obvious one people could point to. We don't want it to be a transparent process where anyone could know where troops were stationed or what sort of military operations were sort of in effect or something like that. But again, when you have this really low threshold under which people start being surveilled, I think it brings up some issues, right? So if I'm searching for questionable things on the internet and I'm under as much surveillance as someone who's actually making threats, you know, that those things should be clear. Those distinctions in surveillance should be clear to probably a more mass audience. So yeah, there's definitely things the government does that we don't, that there's good reason that it be kept private. But I think the sort of net, which has spread out for surveillance, has gotten so big that we need to define more clearly what's worth surveilling and maybe what's not worth those resources, or where people are allowed their privacy regardless of if they have questionable browser histories or something like that.
Do you think people should be more cautious when they're using the internet or writing and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Or does that like intervene with like the freedom of speech or freedom of like the internet, like looking up what you want, like without the concern of like being on a watch list or being surveilled? Like, how do you think people should act?
That's hard to say because you put yourself at risk when you're under surveillance. And not just because there's this idea that if you're not doing anything wrong, then you don't have to worry about being surveilled. I don't think that's a fair argument. I think that people should be able to search for whatever they want without fear, but there are repercussions for that you know, some people might decide it's not worth the risk. But I do think that limits not only our First Amendment rights, but this sort of capacity for imagination and curiosity and just general sort of knowledge, right? If I can't search for what I want to search for without being worried that it might flag me, it means I can't understand the world in the way I want to, or I can't imagine other possibilities outside of what's acceptable. And so I think it's important that people have that option to say that everyone is prepared to take whatever risk might come with that. It's a sort of personal choice, but I would hope that people would still be able to seek out information without it being an issue.
So how can like parents monitor their children when they're using the internet, because they're using the internet at much early ages than ever before?
It's hard to say. You can't be, I don't have children, but I assume you can't be with your child constantly, right? In the same way that, you can't, parents don't sit with their kids every second they're watching TV and explain to them all the sort of complicated things that are going into that process. But there has to be some monitoring function there, and again, that sort of education to say what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, to say what is being taken from them when they go online, or what sort of what the content being targeted at them says, what the issues with that content might be. I mean, it's definitely sort of an education, and it should probably happen both in the home and in schools. There should probably be a more clear lesson of media literacy in schools as well.
Oh yeah, because like they have like their own like personal devices, like smartphones, like at 12, and like social media is like part of their self-identity now.
Right, and you can take it into a room because it's also mobile. And so it's one thing to have your kid sitting and watching TV while you're in the other room, because you can walk in anytime and see it. It's another thing that they can take it into private spaces.
So what risks do children face, like on social media, posting so much personal information at such a young age, and they're going to have to kind of live with that through their whole lives, and this is kind of like the first generation that has ever had to experience that, so it's kind of new and kind of, we don't know where it's going, so. Absolutely.
I guess the one thing about everyone doing it is everyone will have the same embarrassing stuff probably up when they go to run for office, in a few decades. But it is definitely a risk, and I think it's probably going to demand that people sort of reassess what's acceptable and not later, in life. When you're getting a job, if your social media profile goes back to when you were 12, is something you did when you were 13 or 14 or 15 really something you can assess when someone's 25 or something like that. But yeah, I don't envy people who have been on since they were 12 years old.
Well, what about like when it comes to like surveillance, like are they going to predict what children are going to be like when they're older, and so are they going to keep records of that? Like are they going to be like, this 12-year-old has been a threat, so like let's keep an eye on him, like is he going to become like a mass shooter or something? Like are they going to find those patterns? And do you think, is it fair if for like the government to make those patterns to like predict future behavior, or does that kind of invade privacy, or I don't know, kind of like preventing a crime before like it even happens? Like that's kind of scary.
It is, right? And there's lots of science fiction that would concern us with those same sorts of issues. But yeah, to say that you can demand a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old to be perfectly logical and coherent and not say anything stupid, I think isn't really a fair thing to ask of children, right? It might not even be a fair thing to ask of sort of teenagers. But, part of that, again, is the lesson of teaching children the sort of consequences of their, social media engagement. But yeah, it's very possible, I think, that at these early ages, if you start being pulling up these red flags for your activity, that it could follow you the rest of your life. And that's, a pretty scary thing to think about. And the idea of preventing crimes is always, that sounds great, but there's got to be a line that's drawn there. Again, this idea of thought crimes is another sort of science fiction construction, but, you can't, prosecute people for thinking the wrong things or researching the wrong things, because you might be misreading those things as well, right? We saw that example of that CSI writer or whatever it was.
Yeah,
it's like
killing
he says a lot of terrible things.
Yeah.
And there might be reasons to that an algorithm or, something like that can't understand, that a person looking at it and speaking to another human being might be able to understand. And so,
So what issues do you see like arising in like the next 10, 20 years as like technology progresses and all that? Like, because we're on like surveillance right now, but we don't know what's going to happen down the road. what kind of new technology and software is gonna come out.
Yeah.
So are there any problems in like policy or social issues that
Yeah.
are coming up that you see?
I mean, there's always those issues with any sort of new media, right? These sort of implications in culture and politics and in economics. But with new media, people are pointing out that there's this rapid pace of adoption, right? And when you adopt media more and more quickly, these questions and the sort of critical assessment of these implications get sort of pushed aside a little bit because we love new technology and we think of technology as being associated with these ideas of progress. And you wouldn't want to interfere with progress and you wouldn't want to slow down progress. So we push forward and we adopt a lot of things, maybe without critically assessing our roles in our lives quickly enough, right? Where, it hasn't been going so well, but, people are trying to create wearable technologies all the time. And that would dramatically change how people move about the world and how people are surveilled. It would make surveillance a lot easier for a lot of people as well. But we tend to focus on the sort of fun side of this sort of new technology without thinking about maybe their deep implications for culture and economics and politics.
Yeah, because you don't have to be a computer scientist to know how to compute anymore.
Right.
It's becoming more accessible.
Yeah.
And
more integrated into our daily life. So we don't have to
Exactly.
go to a medium and watch it. We don't have to go to a television or go turn on a radio. It's in our pockets. It's carried around with us on a bus. It's in every room of our house. Increasingly, there's also this idea of the Internet of Things. You're familiar with that?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Just this idea of sort of integrating these pieces of technology into everything, basically. So a really simplistic example would be like those Amazon order buttons. Have you seen these?
Yeah.
When you want to order Tide, you just press your Tide button.
And now they have drones and stuff.
Yeah, right? Or inserting RFID chips, radio frequency, so that you can move in and out of your house and it'll adjust to your preferences and stuff like that. But yeah, that's giving technology a lot of access to your information and to your life. Maybe it's just knowing when you're running out of laundry detergent, but it's a lot of other things that increasingly get folded into that idea as well.
Because it's kind of like technology's taking over almost everything.
Right.
Even working out, Fitbits,
Yeah,
keeps track of your movements, your heartbeat, everything like that. And,
yeah.
do you think new technology is kind of taking away from jobs at all? Because everyone's cutting down costs and making it simpler. Because I just saw McDonald's now has you go up there and place your order on a computer screen. That takes a toll on jobs.
It does.
Do you think everyone's scared about that in the future?
Yeah, I think those issues of labor are always super important ones to look at. And maybe you could argue we're just shifting labor to more what's the word I'm looking for? More skilled labor, right? So maybe we have less people who are performing these mundane tasks, but we have more people who are doing more high-level tasks. I don't know if that's totally the case. But I think it also has an impact when you're talking about things like McDonald's or grocery lines and stuff
Even
like that.
journalism.
Yeah.
Because newspapers obsolete pretty much.
Yeah.
And even TV broadcasting, people are just using the internet for information now.
Right.
Which is kind of dangerous too on social media.
Yes. Yeah, those comments are bring out the worst in people, absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, there's the question of labor too, is how much labor are we responsible for as individuals to seek out our own news and to, do all this own work ourselves to be reporters or do all that when we have all this other stuff going on in our lives. It's a lot of responsibility to put on people and then they're not compensated for that labor. If we have to go out and, seek out news or make news ourselves, it's something someone else used to do for us too, right? And there's good things and bad things about that. There's good things about having access to lots of information. There's also good things about having people sort of filter it and bring the most important salient issues to the fore, right? So there's definitely a trade-off with that, especially in something like journalism.
But what about like Facebook or something?
Yeah.
It's very personalized and it kind of learns your patterns and it'll give you the stuff you want to see. So maybe there are stories that aren't necessarily what you want to hear about, but they might be important to know.
Yeah.
So you're only gonna be selected kind of content that is personalized to you. So do you think that's making people more extreme about their views and less kind of in the middle about issues?
I do think on the internet, at least research so far has shown that there tends to be this polarization, right? People tend to seek out information that confirms their own beliefs, or alternately, information that disconfirms their beliefs just so they can shore up their own beliefs again, right? Like, look at this crazy person who thinks the opposite of me. That makes my idea seem more logical and that sort of thing. Yeah, I definitely think that's an issue. In terms of the personalization, again, it's great to have news that speaks to your interests, but there are things that people need to know about broadly, right? And maybe it's not very entertaining, I hope not entertaining, to read about mass shootings, but it's super important, right? And maybe alternately it's super fun to read about celebrities, but what does it matter, right? You can argue it matters, but let's put those two things, pretend they're sort of on extremes there. So there has to be some balance there, and that also takes people dealing with the fact that sometimes they're going to have to consume stuff that's not fun, right? It's like eating your vegetables in terms of media consumption, and people don't want to do it because you have so many other options. Even if the news were the only thing on TV, you would just go to your computer and look up something else or something like that. And you can't force people to read news, and you can't force them to watch news. So people have to, this is a point I think where people as individuals have to say, I'm responsible for knowing about these world events. Alternately, to put the responsibility on newsmakers, they have to say, I don't care if this story is more entertaining or better to look at, if this very important issue needs to be reported first and foremost. So it's sort of a shared responsibility there. And then owners of media companies have to sort of support media organizations in those efforts as well.
Yeah, okay, I have one last question.
Yeah.
It's about advertising again. How do you see advertising changing and shifting? Because children who watch commercials, they're not really affected by it anymore. That's what they say.
Right.
So how is advertising going to change to kind of get those younger demographics to consume, be consumers?
I think advertising, I don't know what the next step will be, but goes more and more in your face all the time, right? So there's used to be just advertising in the background and you would see it or you would not see it, and then it gets put in front of you or you have to watch it to gain access to other content. There are efforts for guerrilla advertising as well, where people would want to participate with it, so you'd be more invested in it as well, right? Advertising that actually involves people touching it or lifting up pieces or things like that. I'm sure it'll just be more places all the time, right? It's on fruit, so you pick a fruit and you have to see it, or it's on the gas pump, so you have to see it when you pump gas. But you do learn to sort of ignore those things as well. So they're just going to keep trying to make it more and more impossible to ignore. I don't know how that's going to be, but that's, I think, the main goal, always going back through advertising history, is just to make things as difficult to ignore as possible.
That's basically what it is,
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you.
Of course.